Good evening, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Good to see you, Patricia. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
It's good to see you. Good morning from Los Angeles. Oh, wow, you're far. We're evening. Nice to see you. We're waiting a few seconds for everyone to join. It's nice to start the year with a chat, a great opportunity to exchange again. So let me begin by wishing you a Happy New Year with and crossing our fingers that this 2021 will be a better cru, as we say with the French wines. You know, we like wine to be fruitful and strong and positive and with lots of energy and fruit. Well, that's what we wish for 2021, with greater health and more positive around our world. We know how difficult things have been, including over Christmas for most of us. Now we are starting a new year, and we want to set this new encounter and discussion. We chose to talk about feedback and how feedback can help people develop their positive relationships or not, depending on how you approach feedback. And we would like to start by opening up to your sharing some experience feedback, so that we can bounce from your experience and your feedback, your stories, rather than speak and tell you where we are. It's better for us to react from what you have to say rather than impose something. We want these chats to be participative. And as we move every month, what we would like to do actually is to set a mode where ahead of the chat, you send us some ideas and we select a few examples so that you actually have the floor to begin with. So that's how we'll move forward. But for this first one, if anyone wants to just grab the mic and share something about the feedback that you have experienced that was challenging and that made your life more difficult, then we'll react and respond in terms of advice and how to approach feedback in a more effective way. So who wants to lead and take the floor on a feedback story that you can share with us? A moment of feedback that was challenging or difficult. We'll give you a bit of time so that you feel comfortable. Don't be shy.
Well, I could start with a bad example.
Go ahead.
It was at a previous company. We had a very dictatorial director, and everybody basically was always afraid when entering that person's office, because you knew it didn't mean anything good. And I don't know whether I would call that feedback. Yes, in some way it was feedback, but mostly it was, I don't know, slashing. So in that respect, I hope I will never get into a situation like that again. But you basically walked out of that office like that small. And my reaction to that behavior was I clammed up. If I didn't have absolutely solid facts to try to bring them across, and I learned very quickly it didn't matter whether I had facts or not. So in the end, I just shut down, let it all storm over me, and then said goodbye, and I left the office basically. But how do you react to a manager like that, who is so like explosive and basically I didn't even know how to respond to something like that.
Well, I think this is an interesting case that's probably referred to what we discussed about toxic management last time.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, and it's not exactly, as you said, it's not exactly a feedback situation. So we'll talk about it, but we'll move then to more what it is, an actual feedback. But this situation of a behavior that is characteristic of a personal situation where a manager can be very abrupt or rude, and this is more of a type of personality than an actual specific behavior. It's of course very, very difficult to manage. And to answer that question, I would say the first thing I would say, to be able to answer that, we should of course know much more about this actual situation that you were in, and what about this person is. Okay, that's the way not to answer that question, of course. But if we want to think about how to address or how to respond to somebody who's kind of very unpredictable, or very abrupt or very insulting, of course you have to find the right behavior to that. And I think one of the things you might think about, and it's not answering specifically the question, is to try to change the place. So in other words, if you are in a sort of very aggressive mode of discussion, you have to change the tone of the conversation as you can. Okay, because if you remain in this sort of situation, you will stay and you will go up your ladder very quickly, and the person will do the same. And therefore, if you don't change anything in the relationship that you have with this person at the moment we speak, then there is no way this situation is going to improve. It's going to actually deteriorate, and it can deteriorate very, very quickly. Now, I would need more information about this person to know whether this person is permanently aggressive, or because she was aggressive because you had a situation where it was a reaction that this person couldn't take what you did or what you said or whatever. But of course, that's difficult to answer a specific question. Now, that leads me to this question around feedback, because there's a bit of common point to this. And the starting point, which I can make before giving you back the floor, is that in situations like this, we tend to go up and discuss about things that are not necessarily related to the initial original reason why there was disagreement or a problem. And this is the real first rule of the feedback that I would give you, is to say everything has to start with a fact or a situation. So in other words, feedback, whether positive or negative, should always start on the basic and the observation of an actual fact and situation. So when I say that, it means that feedback, positive feedback, can be as poor feedback as a negative one. If somebody tells you you're a great communicator, you should not take that as a feedback. This is not feedback. This is a judgment on who you are. It's far more interesting to say, well, yesterday in that meeting, you were a great communicator, right? Same on the negative side. So situation and fact, this is where you need to start as far as feedback and sort of managing a relationship is concerned. I don't know if it answers specifically your question, but that's a nice spot to get into the conversation on feedback.
I'd like to add two things about difficult feedback situations or exchange. What you're describing, Patricia, may not be really feedback situation as you actually expressed. It's only one way, and people summon you or are aggressive in the way they address you. It's not really a feedback situation. The way to get back to the feedback moment could be to open questions. And if the person is constantly summoning or saying things that are statements that seem to be judgments rather than discussions, then ask questions, phrase and ask for clarification. Inquiry and advocacy, are really very important tools in trying to install a form of dialogue. But when you're not in a dialogue, you're not in a question of feedback. And the very difference between feedback and evaluation or assessment is that if you want feedback, then it's really coming down the ladder and looking at facts and data, situation, rather than so-called truth that are you be shouted at you and that you cannot respond to. So the notion of dialogue and feedback, I always say, going back to the French translation of feedback, feedback is to feed. So to feed is a vital element, and back means that if there's a back, it means there was a move forward. So it's a back and forth. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have this situation of dialogue, then there cannot be any kind of feedback. So trying to install a situation of dialogue where you can speak, where you can ask questions, and if there's none, then you leave the room. And maybe the question is moving out of the room or getting a next meeting in another place, so that the person, because sometimes feedback that is aggressive or situations you describe are connected to the place where you are. And people are, in power in their own office, as you were describing, and they feel they have the power, so they have the right to speak to you in a certain way. But this is not feedback. So setting the ground and the conditions for feedback to happen is a preliminary work for feedback to actually possible. Does anybody else have another situation that you'd like to share of a moment of exchange that did not go as well as you would like to be or to have happened in another part of the world, maybe? Some of you are in Brazil, you said in the chat. One of you is in LA.
It can be a situation where you receive difficult feedback, but also be a situation where you were the person giving feedback and you had a tremendous difficult time to actually do that for many, many reasons. So both are actually very interesting examples.
If I can, but it was more a question than a situation. I was wondering, and I wanted to get some advices or maybe some explanation details about this following question. Should we give feedback in one-to-one situation, so privilege one-to-one situation to give feedback or receive feedback, or is it better sometimes also to go to give feedback within a team or within an event where you have multiple parties and where you can also especially, I don't think it's the case for difficult feedback, but for good feedback could be also a way to emphasize the positive aspects of this.
Well, I think that's a very important point, because our initial reaction would say one-on-one is better because there's an intimacy, nothing gets out of the room, and therefore you can actually be more open and more direct with the person. But as you said, there's positive and negative feedback. Now, if you want to consider a group feedback, or at least a feedback exercise within a group or a team, I think that's a very interesting way of looking at it. But then it requires for me one thing, which is basically you give everyone the possibility to give feedback. And it's actually happening in some companies now when you have peer feedback, as we call it. So it's not just the boss giving a feedback to someone, but it's also the rest of the team giving feedback to a certain situation. So there's a difference between praising someone in a public, right, step, where you say, well, I want to recognize Valerie's contribution to this because she did a great job, etc. This is not really feedback. This is praising, right? But then you can say, look, we had this project, and there's a stage where it didn't work so well, and we need to analyze that together and just sort of take the learnings and do the postmortem of it. Then it might turn to be some kind of a feedback to one person who was maybe at the origin of the problem. And therefore you sort of share the floor with the rest of the team and say, okay, we can do that. And then we can actually share what we think about this. And it can be done, but it has to be done with a lot of benevolence and a lot of empathy, because you don't want that to be a kind of a trial or something. So depending on what is your strategy, then it can become easy. Now, one thing that is kind of interesting in what you said is the risk of feedback is always that the person can be feeling attacked personally, right, as a person. And of course, doing that even on a one-on-one is already difficult, but it's in front of the group, and I feel personally attacked, I'm going to be really feeling insulted, and it's going to be very tough. Now, one of the way out of this is to remember this rule that always talk about a situation, something that has been done and not. So you use the word do and not is. You don't say to the person, you were not this, but you didn't do this, right? Because if I receive a feedback, well, you tell me in this project, you actually messed up yesterday's meeting, I couldn't take that. If you say you are a disastrous communicator, and by the way, this is what happened yesterday, I can feel very, very concerned about it. So depending on what you want to achieve, then you can actually adapt your strategy. There's some golden rule, I would say, that remains valid in several situations. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, it does.
The point of group feedback makes me think about sports. You know, when you're a coach in a team sport, how you address the group and you're trying to positively encourage people to move together. Well, in business environment, it's the same thing with project management. For example, you have a team and you want to push the project forward. It's to take in consideration the project itself, so everyone is involved, but everyone is involved from different perspectives. And the good thing about group advice or group feedback is that you can focus on the task rather than on the person. But at you definitely, as Philippe was saying, you have to be very careful about how every individual will take that feedback, because everyone will take it differently, because they come from a different background and they have a different sensibility to what you say, so they will receive what you say differently. And it's very difficult to take that into account. And the risk is that people will take personally something that is not addressed to them as a person. So the way you formulate, the way you speak, and very importantly, I would like to really highlight again the fact that you're not addressing who the person is in your feedback, but what the person has done and what the project entails and what the tasks entail, then it really helps. Now, finally, having the multiple perspective on feedback is very, very helpful, because rather than having one point of view, then you have several, and then you can make your own opinion about what it is you want to learn from this interaction. So that's the value of collective interaction and collective feedback, although it's much more difficult to handle than, I would say, one-on-one feedback when it's meant to be, supportive and even in a difficult situation.
Yeah, in addition, I assume that especially for negative or difficulties, it could be great to discuss that as a group, not to blame anybody, but just maybe as a reflection or a brainstorming session to find a solution out or resolution or a way of improvement of all of this.
Yeah. Again, for every type of situation where feedback is involved, the preparation is essential. How you prepare for this moment, particularly when the feedback and the situation is going to be difficult on both ends, and how you create the conditions for things to happen in the best possible way. And those conditions involve the place, the physical place. If it's a video conference, take into account where people are and what the mindset are. We use a check-in, for example, when we do video or visio sessions like we're doing right now, and we're doing a coaching or a teamwork. We take the temperature of everyone. It's only a few seconds per person, but at least everyone is involved. The conditions are there, so everyone feels included and involved in the moment. And that's part of the check-in, making sure that everyone says a word to say, I'm here, I'm with you, I'm listening, and so on. And those are ways of creating those conditions for feedback to happen in a smooth way, no matter what the impact is going to be. And same thing when you leave the feedback, make sure that everyone who's leaving the feedback is leaving with something, and you have an idea of what that something is, and not just out of the blue, or we don't know where they're going and how they're living. Because the feedback is not just a moment, it's how people go away with it afterwards. That can be very, very, sometimes a trauma for some.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
And I think this question of negative feedback is always kind of difficult, because when we develop this kind of strategy of listening, etc., sometimes it sounds a bit too nice, right? So yeah, but sometimes we may be in a situation where emotion comes in, and it's become very difficult to sort of stay quiet. And I want to tell this guy that he's done shit, right? So it's kind of sometimes complex. And I think, again, and not living in a sort of perfect world, sometimes you are facing situations very tense. Now, if you remember only this, which is again to talk about situation and facts and to really address somebody's achievement, actions, then you can go far in challenging. You know, I can challenge you very, very big if you are just talking about yesterday's meeting. I cannot go that far if I say you are poor at making your point clear, or you are not good at managing your teams. Those general judgments actually become very sensitive, and I cannot really articulate something that will be useful for the conversation with the person. As Valerie said, the feedback has only one value if the person can actually take that challenge or that feedback away and do something about it. If it's considered as a judgment of who I am, I'm not going to do something, and that becomes a destructive feedback. Okay, so destructive feedback, if I attack the who, I cannot go very far, and I could destroy a lot. If I work on from facts, I can go very far, and the person can take that as data and materials to walk away and work from very nicely with no nothing at stake and no no real risk of losing my confidence, etc. It's a constructive work, and that's pretty important in terms of feedback, and that's usually what's missing in a feedback process. One of the things that is also important to remember because of that is when you have a feedback discussion with someone, whether you received or gave feedback, it's important to sort of start and work from shared experience, something that somebody has really an experience on. So if you give a feedback that I've heard from my colleagues that you are not this or you did this, has absolutely no value. I cannot trust you if you just tell me that you heard by somebody else that I did something wrong, right? So you should not even consider that. So the shared experience is something that can be also a good starting point. Unless we've shared something, I cannot really talk about it.
We have some messages.
Yeah.
Shouldn't we rather think of useful feedback or constructive feedback? And also, they have more challenging is give feedback to senior management when it can backfire more than bring positive changes or step forward.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. The one common point in the two points about useful feedback, constructive feedback, or feedback to management that for which you feel you're at risk, because based on what you say, something might happen, there might be consequences, brings up the question of the before and after, because there's a moment of feedback, there is a setting and a moment where feedback is happening, but before that moment, something can happen, and after that moment, something can happen. And I think this is where it all plays, because if you prepare the grounds well enough, if you yourself are confident enough, if you've done your job as creating the conditions for the feedback to happen in the best possible situation, then the likelihood of feedback to happen smoothly, even when it's difficult, because again, the constructive setting is there, even when it's difficult, people leave with something to learn from. And so that's for the preparation. And for the after the feedback, if again, those conditions are right, you can plan on getting something out of it. So checking at the end of your moment of feedback, even in a challenging situation, which is the last question from Vibav, it's the capacity to, after you leave the moment, that the person who with whom you were will feel good about it. So if your manager has given you negative feedback or tough feedback and you've responded toughly and roughly and you're afraid that you might be fired because you went out of your mind, it's because the conditions, the setting was not prepared well enough. So you have to make sure that those conditions are strong and that you have known as much as possible about the situation beforehand. and then the likelihood of leaving with something that's positive is higher. I want to give you one example based on a real life person who had a problem with giving feedback, negative feedback, in the restructuring of his company. He was moving people around, and one person was at a certain level, and he had to downgrade the person in his team. And he had to tell the person before he would tell the team. So there was 2 levels of communication, to the person herself and to the rest of the team. What was very difficult for him, and where courage came into place, was for him to be confident enough that the person would leave the room with the feeling that even though she was downgraded in her job, she wouldn't feel downgraded as a person. And her self-esteem and her ability to move ahead with her career was still resonant with the positive side. And the way he worked through it was to bring in other members of the group by sharing, well, your new job, your new role is going to be this. You may perceive that it's downgraded, and maybe on the org chart it is. But in reality, your task will be more in connection with what you like to do, with what you can do, with what you can bring to the company. And there's so much you can still bring to the company and to the team, that we need you, that we need your qualities, and we need your input, and so on. So the person felt that in giving that very difficult feedback, everyone was involved. And that's very important. If you remain at one level that I take it personal, I'm affected, and I'm not going to go anywhere with it, then it's going to be negative for everyone in the end. So you want to bring some element of learning from everyone, and I always go back to this learning posture. And no matter what happens in your environment and surroundings, if you can try and learn something from everything you do, I think we will grow, and that's what's so difficult is to accept that there is always something to learn, even when the moment is not so fun or so positive as it goes. So it's a long subject, and we don't have enough time to go in depth, I know, but
just maybe if I can react on this.
Yeah.
On this example, because I saw something similar, right? In my experience, also the person was downgraded. So in a way it was handled in a good way, yeah, but I felt also, me as a colleague, that the topic itself was not addressed, because nobody really told the person what needs to be changed, in order to continue to move further. So I felt myself a bit lack of courage from management not to go further in this conversation, and to do it maybe in layers or something. So I understand that, you cannot just in one message deliver all the feedback. But, in a way, I felt that, okay, it was a good way to, let's say, contourner, to go on the other side of the situation. But still, in order for the person of growth, a step was really important, was missed. Maybe not straight at that moment, maybe later, but, to really also discuss why the person cannot be promoted, what needs to be developed, and something like this.
And what you bring up is also a very important point, is that feedback is not just a moment, it's a process. It's a step-by-step moment. It's not just one shot, you say one thing and it's it. That when you, for example, you give a grade to someone, you say it's A+, A-, or 20 out of 20, if we look at different school system, then it's something that falls on you. The feedback is not that. The feedback is an ongoing process of sharing and exchanging, where you can go back and forth. So there are pivotal moments in feedback, but it is a process where there is a before, a during, and after, and then it repeats itself, because as you were very rightfully saying it, there is that moment, but then there are other steps where you can learn and improve and get other perspectives and other feedback. Actually, this is why when we do the Savoir-Relier, it's so important that you do not just one duo, but as many duos as you can. And I see Sami is here with us, and I want to say hello to Sami, who's been very supportive in responding to all the learners on Coursera and on the Savoir-Relier platform. That when you do so many duos, you each time learn something new, and you discover new aspects because you gain perspective from different people, and that helps you grow. And feedback the same way. if you have one feedback, there's also ways of balancing the feedback you get by getting other feedback from other people about the same situation or the same question. And that's one way of gaining perspective and of growing into what feedback can bring to you. Whether you're receiving or giving, it works both ways. I'm sorry, we're running out of time. It's so fast.
Maybe one last question from Olga Uvarova. What do you think about sandwich rule when we give negative feedback?
Right. Okay. So the sandwich rule is that you give a positive one and then you slash the negative one and then you finish up with a positive one, if I understand it well. Of course, there's a bit of a kind of a makeup and packaging. At the end of the day, I think we are as individuals very clever. So the strategy of trying to package that in such a way that, you know, at the end of the day, I try to faire passer la pilule, as we say in French. You know, I tell you nice things for you to swallow the rest. I think is not necessarily a very good one. Now, it can show some benevolence or some willingness to be nice, but at the end of the day, people will be hurt. And so I don't think that should be a good solution, because it will be probably be misperceived by people. I think it's not a matter of quantity, it's more a question of quality. And I think the point that can help actually get out of this is that, and compared to the discussion we just had about bad news, feedback is not about bad news. You know, if you have to break a news to someone and say, you're going to lose your job, that's not a feedback session. This is, I'm going to tell you that because of this restructuring, you're going to lose your job. That's a tough decision that you have to share. And here I completely buy this question around the courage, but that should be the part of a separate conversation. Feedback shouldn't be about bad news. And because if you again do that on a regular basis, if you do that on facts and situations, okay, it's not because you were bad yesterday in a meeting that the world is ending, right? So you can take this because you are a professional. And by the way, I'll tell you something that was a challenging thing from you yesterday, but yesterday you also did, for example, something great. So I can give you good news and bad news, but it is actually information I give you to build something. So tough decisions, bad decision, courage is one thing. Feedback is about feeding me with something that will make me better for the future. And I think there's a real difference between the two.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time, and you know, these sessions are very snappy, so 30 minutes is very fast. We want to maintain them on a monthly basis, and as we said at the beginning of this session today, we would like for you to come up with some written suggestions beforehand, so we can select a few of you and you prepare. You're into the session, and then you can speak more, and we can have different selected cases that we can work from and talk about. We'll have topics that you raise and that you get to us with. So we create a form of continuum. This idea of the sessions is for us, the community of Savoir-Relier, to get together and to keep on meeting. Thank you for joining today, and Happy New Year to everyone. We'll meet again in a month, and we'll have more to come with news and courses as we are developing many of our activities in the year to come.
One thing before we break, I see a lot of questions, and especially one from Karen say, well, you didn't answer the question around the superior, feedback to superior, which I completely agree with. Now, we will pick some of the questions. You can actually keep writing here, and we will answer for those questions. We will give you an answer by writing, because I've got some few things to give you about this. It can be helpful. Okay, so keep the conversation going. We can actually communicate.
Actually, Vaibhav was actually raising his hand in order to ask a question, I think. So as you were saying, maybe if you can write your questions and we will answer to them by email, as wrote Camila.
It was not a question. Probably I just wanted to share. Somebody asked a question about the sandwich feedback, and just something came into my mind, and I thought I should share. I don't know if it will be accepted or received in the same way, but when we give feedback, we should always give something called feed forward. With every negative feedback, we should say, what's the way forward to improve? So the feedback and the feed forward should come together. I just wanted to share with everyone.
That's very good.
Thank you for pointing this. There is actually a whole range of techniques and advice on feed-forward interviews where you ask questions to move forward. So this is definitely part of what we're talking about. The before, the during, and the after, the moving forward. And the feed-forward interviews are there to go ahead and move forward. So thank you for bringing that up. It's definitely part of the discussion. We will get back to you and we will keep you posted on our developments. Thank you very much for all of you. There were many of you tonight to join. I mean, this morning for some of you. We're trying to get the best time. We think that evening French time is easier for Pacific time to join. So we look forward to more, and definitely every month and ongoing, we'll have these discussions together. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a nice weekend.
Great month.